Hello and welcome to Reasoned UK. Please do consider hitting that subscribe button and the notification bell if you enjoy today's content. I'm absolutely certain that you will, because I've got a fascinating guest lined up for you today. Now, I'm Darren Grimes, for those who don't know, and we have a GoFundMe link in the description which ensures that we can keep our content free, so please do consider supporting us if you're in a position to do so. Anyway, on to today's show. 2020 is considered to be pretty sobering reading for anyone who wants to look back through the history books at what is, quite frankly, a sodding insane way to actually go about politics to many of us across the political spectrum. Violent protests and riots with looting, burning and all worse have erupted after the death of George Floyd in May 2020, and American cities were transformed. Now, from here in the United Kingdom, whilst we did have episodes of violence take place in London, those of us scrolling through our smartphones, through social media feeds, would have been forgiven for thinking that some of the scenes that we witnessed were in the third world and not the world's most powerful and supposedly free nation state, the United States of America. One radical group dominated that battlefield, Antifa, self-described anti-fascists. And I use that in inverted commas, actually. They deploy aggressive and violent tactics that have destroyed businesses and livelihoods under their banner. Will they now stop that Joe Biden is in the White House and their favourite bogeyman, Donald J. Trump, has gone? Well, my guest today understands Antifa better than most. During the summer of 2019, Andino was brutally beaten by members of the group whilst on a journalistic assignment at a rally in Portland in the US, where he was brought up. His new book, Unmasked, inside Antifa's radical plan to destroy democracy, which Antifa, by the way, is trying to stop being sold in bookshops, has been propelled to the top spot for weeks before its February 2nd release date. A rarity, as the Washington Examiner says, for books not penned by long-time authors and presidents. Anyway, that's enough from me. Without further ado, here's Andy No, an American journalist that serves as an editor-at-large of the Post-Millennial. Hi, Andy.
Thank you for having me on.
Oh, no, thank you so much for giving up your time. Now, Andy, I just want to play this clip and I'll have you explain what's been going on. This is from Portland's local news channel. And I just want you to, after we've played it, explain what's been going on with bookstores when it comes to attempts at censoring or indeed cancelling stores for carrying your book, which exposes Antifa.
New at 4, Powell's is closed early again today because of a protest. Now, Powell's Books announced they would not carry local right-wing blogger Andy No's book on their shelves, but will online. Powell's decision followed a protest outside the store yesterday and again today. Now, No rose to national prominence as an outspoken critic of Antifa after activists attacked him for documenting a milkshake-themed protest in Portland in 2019. That is No right there in the video. His book, Unmasked, Inside Antifa's Radical Plan to Destroy Democracy, is slated for release in February. So No sent us this statement just a few hours ago saying, given that Powell's dedicates part of every year to banned and censored books, it's a shame they've made the decision to restrict in-store sales of a book by a local author weeks ahead of release. However, I also have sympathy for them given how ruthless Antifa has been in vandalizing and hurting local businesses. You can also read the...
So, Andy, just how bad has it been? Just how ruthless have they been in seeking the cancellation of your book?
So the riots that happened throughout American cities last year, the city that had it the worst was Portland, where I was based out of. And that's also the epicenter of Antifa political violence in the United States. That's not a coincidence. What we saw was more than 120 days of daily riots that occurred over and over every night. And it wasn't just like street hooligans breaking stuff on the street. They were actually setting buildings on fire, state government buildings, institutions, facilities, private businesses. They were using explosives, they brought blades, they brought guns, and unfortunately even led to a homicide. But it wasn't just Portland that experienced months of rioting and political violence. In nearby Seattle, Washington, which is the largest city in the Pacific Northwest, there were BLM Antifa extremists who actually took over 6 blocks of city property near downtown and claimed it as their own autonomous territory. They called it the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, otherwise known as Chaz. So Unmasked details and chronicles what happened last year across America in these riots, how they were organized, how the funding worked, what happened in their autonomous zones. And it also details the deadly violence that has been carried out by Antifa. Very few people know the details of what has happened in 2019 and 2020 by self-described Antifa extremists.
Mm. And this has all gotten pretty bad, right, Andy, because you felt the need to actually flee the country.
I have had to flee the country, and it brings me no joy. My family background is a story of refugees. My parents found refuge and settlement in the United States after they escaped the communist regime of Vietnam in the 70s, and they both went to prison camps. I write about that a bit in the book. But over the last year, the DOJ had issued a statement alluding to some American cities as essentially anarchist jurisdictions. And I don't think that was hyperbole. I know it was lampooned quite a bit by the mainstream left-wing press. But really, you're having in cities like Portland and Seattle, New York to a degree, San Francisco, you have prosecutors who are elected politicians coming in with this agenda of so-called reformative justice, which essentially means that they're putting at the forefront they're not going to hold criminals accountable. So last year, at the height of the extreme violence in Portland, the new district attorney came in, and his office's policy right away was literally and officially to decriminalize felony rioting. And so I've been chronicling the arrests over the months and months and months. We have a sample size of more than 1,000 cases. More than 90% of them had their charges immediately dropped. People were back on the streets again. So the book details all these pieces that are put together that have created this system that allows anarchy and chaos to flourish. And there have been escalating threats of violence against me ever since even before I was beaten in 2019. And all of it was reported to police. The death threats, people had released my address and family's contact information and locations online, and they have written it around the city. And all those reports to the local police and even the FBI have led nowhere. So it's really quite painful, actually, to see my family's adopted country that I have to leave.
As you say, though, you reveal details in this book about being on the ground and on the inside, really, with members of Antifa. How did you go about doing that? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, but Antifa or proponents of it would argue that you're only giving selective reports, or the videos that you post throughout your journalism and your fantastic Twitter account, you're only being selective with what you post and all the rest of it. But they can't argue that if you've actually been on the inside, right?
That's right. I was on the inside of some of these protests turned riots, and I detailed the tactics that I had to carry out to be able to slip by undetected. I wasn't successful 100% of the time. I was exposed in Seattle as well as in Portland on a few occasions, which is very dangerous. And on one of the two, I was actually assaulted again. And so it's very, very dangerous work for independent journalists who are covering Antifa. And it's a travesty that the legacy mainstream press don't really give them accurate and proper coverage. And if you read the mainstream coverage of Antifa, you actually would just think that they are a movement of anti-fascists who are opposing white supremacists and neo-Nazis. You wouldn't know about the organized violence. You wouldn't know about the calls for overthrowing the government. You wouldn't know about the calls to kill political opponents. And I document that all in the book.
Because they try in an attempt, what must be a sort of naked attempt really, to smear you and others who are making this case for reporting on these rally and demonstrations and all the rest of it. They try and smear you by saying that you're far right. They try and smear you. It's almost gaslighting, right? By saying we're anti-fascists, we're the good guys, and the media just laps this stuff up. That's a real problem as far as accountability is concerned, isn't it?
Yes, and it's such a juvenile trick that has fooled so many of us, in that people actually think that Antifa, anti-fascists, they think Black Lives Matter is simply a movement for racial justice for blacks. It's not. Antifa, if you look at their ideology and what they call for, it's an anarchist, communist, revolutionary movement that espouses terroristic tactics against citizens and the state. BLM, by the statements of their founders and those who are leaders in those movements, is a Marxist revolutionary movement who venerates communist killers and murderers. These are a lot of things that people don't know about these movements that shield themselves by just saying simply that they're fighting for racial justice, social justice, etc. And anybody who reports critically or writes critical commentary about them is deemed anti-black, pro-fascist, a fascist propagandist. They tried to do that to me. They tried to get me. They've been quite empowered, particularly after Trump was banned from Twitter. They feel that this is their time to really flex their muscles, and there have been calls by journalists that I be banned off Twitter. So they're trying to clear out the competition right now, and I'm not particularly encouraged by 2021. Just there's been riots that have happened. Everyone's focused on the Capitol Hill riots. People don't pay any attention to the fact that we've had 4 riots in Portland since New Year's Eve, including one on the same day as Capitol Hill riots against a government building by Antifa. And Twitter's competitor Parler's been essentially erased off the internet. So
how much do you think that this is all sort of an attempt to silence voices like yourself, which are, unfortunately, I guess, dissenting voices that go against the grain as far as the media is concerned, as far as shining a spotlight on what took place last year and the violence, the looting, the burning, all the rest of it? How much do you think that social media is increasingly becoming a place in which you just can't expose this stuff because you risk, Twitter might get rid of you tomorrow, who knows? How much are you worried that actually big tech censorship is almost, they're sort of the best PR guys that Antifa and organizations like them could ask for, right?
yeah, so being on Twitter, I feel like I'm under the sword of Damocles, because really at literally any moment I can just be, by the click of a button, permanently banned and never be able to not just access my account, but not be able to open another account and do anything on its platform again. And with it being a monopoly and such an important platform for journalists, it would be like a disadvantage. I can't even think of a word. It would be crippling, really. And but I have no choice. I just have to continue to go forward. I think the calls to try to silence me have been even escalating more, just because the book is very close to release, and as that news clip you played, there's been pretty loud efforts to get the book banned in Portland, and Portland's largest bookstore, Powell's, gave in right away, just because a bunch of people who were allowed on Twitter and social media were complaining. So they pulled it off, or they promised not to sell it on its shelves, even though nobody has read it because it's not out yet. But that wasn't good enough for Antifa.
Surely anyone, I don't understand, I can't for the life of me understand why anyone on the left watching people gather outside of a bookstore to try and threaten the owners of the business. I assume it's quite a small bookstore. I doubt it's nationwide, right?
It's the largest bookstore in Portland, but it is a small business.
Yeah. So a small business that's clearly, it's a business which is struggling because of the likes of Amazon and all the rest of it, which dominate the market. And
COVID.
yet they can allow these people to gather outside the store and try and cancel a book. It's essentially a modern day book burning, and yet people just don't pay attention to it. They just turn a blind eye. You've only got the likes of, I saw you were on Fox News, I saw you were on a few other news channels, but that's about it. That's as much coverage as you're going to get. There are no voices on the left saying, hang on a minute, this is really, really quite troubling times for democracy.
That's right. I think what makes Antifa powerful is that they've been able to find so many mainstream allies on the left, those in the Democrat Party, and just more mainstream liberals in general, which I think if they were aware of Antifa's true ideology and agenda, they would not join forces with them. But they saw a mutual enemy in the Trump administration. And now that this dragon has been allowed to grow, they're not going to so easily be able to just put it down. And judging by the flyers and posters that have been put out for the 20th of January, J20 Inauguration Day, Antifa are calling for riots across the country. So we'll see if that happens later on today.
Yeah. Are you hoping then that this book will sort of be a catalyst to actually, more than anything, exposing this group, but actually giving people the easily accessible tools to actually understand what it's all about, what they're doing, that they're not just a group of sort of nice sounding, laudable aiming anti-fascists campaigning under the banner of Black Lives Matter and all the rest of it. Actually, these people do not wish America well. They actually wish to implement really quite serious radical change. They want to smash up the system and more. They're not just happy with smashing up property, assets, all the rest of it. They're pretty serious in what they're doing, and America is in peril, I guess, at the moment with this group in action.
Yeah, it doesn't. From the outside perspective, somebody who's looking in and looking at things closely may think America is just kind of operating as normal. We just had election, transition of power now. People, there are still city councils, governors, mayors, everything's running as operated. But as you were seeing in the book, and you can just go to a city in Portland and in Seattle, and parts of it are first world slums. Police departments are being defunded by the tens of millions, hundreds of millions, and in the case of New York City, NYPD, $1 billion. Officers are resigning en masse, leaving, retiring early. We're having skyrocketing crime. In addition to that, it's also the economic devastation of policies enacted by the government in reaction to COVID. So, this is the first time in my life that I felt like it really challenged my, I guess, hubris before, in thinking that a juggernaut like the U.S. could be endangered. It's a powerful nation state, but it's not invincible. And I think seeing how this movement, network of different extremist domestic terrorist groups on the far left were able to really destabilize local governments and continue to do so, it's telling. And they don't face really any opposition. They don't face opposition much from federal authorities, local law enforcement, because they just get let out, their charges get dropped. The media protects them. Big tech is their ally in many ways. When people read the book, a lot of the funding actually happens right in front of our eyes using sites like GoFundMe, Venmo, Cash App, and they've actually been able to fundraise literally tens of millions of dollars in 2020 to buy riot gear, to pay the bail bonds. And another thing that I published for the first time in the book is I've actually been leaked the internal documents from Rose City Antifa, which is the largest and oldest Antifa organization in the United States. And it really disproves a statement that is repeated like a mantra that Antifa is not an organization. I mean, there is no single Antifa, there are multiple Antifa groups, and some of them are organized as formal of an organization as it can get, in terms of there's a membership process, there's a vetting process, people get voted in or out, they get radicalized. Like, so people need to take this way more serious than just thinking that it's just people dressed in black breaking stuff on the street. Your country has a history of, you know, football hooligans and stuff, and you know, it's much more serious than that. It's an ideology that has been systematically mainstreamed on the left. Like, you can look up fundamental tenets of Antifa ideology, and they're not even controversial in the mainstream American left anymore. For example, looting, destruction of property, political violence, as long as you do it for a left-wing cause, all of that is like now justified. And that's the quickest way to really undo liberal democracy and the norms that create a prosperous and safe society for us all.
Yeah, absolutely. Wasn't even Kamala Harris, now vice president, wasn't she posting links to bailout funds as well?
Yeah, I write about that in the book. So she and staffers who worked on the Biden campaign actually tweeted out not just the link that people could pay and donate to the Minnesota Freedom Fund, which is the organization that collected $35 million to bail out people who are accused of rioting, accused of other heinous crimes such as sex crimes, attempted murder. The American vice president tweeted out to her millions of followers to donate to that cause. And those who worked on the campaign for now President Joe Biden tweeted out that they donated to it and that you should too. So I think they did that out of ignorance, but this is what I mean when I say like there's just really no rioting for the left-wing cause is seen as noble in the US. So I recently wrote a column in the New York Post about the hypocrisy of Democrats and media and those generally on the left now who helped describe what happened on the 6th of January in the Capitol Hill in DC as another 9/11, another Pearl Harbor. I just wonder, why were they at best silent last year when my city was under siege, when people tried to burn down a federal courthouse in downtown, when they came with explosives, they came with power tools to cut down the barriers, they came with knives, they came with lasers to blind people in the eyes. Why were they silent last year at best, and at worst they actually donated to the causes?
Yeah, we had in this country, you know, as with all things American, the sort of we try and import America's struggles for some reason. I've never really been able to understand that, why, you know, something that's happening elsewhere, we feel the need to sort of take on those problems. But anyway, putting that to one side, our BBC, after there were violent protests in London, the BBC said, you know, they were mostly peaceful, whilst reporting on injuries of police officers. And I wonder then, Andy, much of the political and media class, as you say, they've argued that there's no comparison between the violent upstarts, which you mentioned in Portland and elsewhere, between those who did that and those marching towards the Capitol this month, and the riots, burning and looting and all the rest of it that have taken place elsewhere under the banner of Black Lives Matter throughout 2020. What do you think of that? Are there comparisons to be made between the two? Do you just think this is sort of, again, this is gaslighting? This is them trying to sort of switch things around?
It is gaslighting because 4 years ago, there were violent extremists in the nation's capital who did not accept the results of that democratic election in 2016 and in the inauguration in 2017. They rioted in DC, they set property on fires, they came with riot gear, and that was essentially lauded by the left. When the Metropolitan Police, the DC police, carried out the arrests of hundreds of people, that was called, the headlines at that time were, "This is the evidence of the now fascist regime under Trump," when these were people who were trying to hurt those who were attending the inauguration because they did not accept the election results. And, fast forward 4 years, we saw similar actions on the 6th of January. Those rioters happened to get further because they actually got into the Capitol building. And you can't just say that you are against political violence if you're only against it for your opponents, and yet you support those tactics on your side. And that's the issue I'm having with the mainstream left. And of course, yes, it needs to be said, not every liberal supported the political violence on the left, but most of them were damn silent when it was happening last year. And when it happens again, they will be silent, right? You still see them repeating the same lies of BLM from 6 years ago about Michael Brown and other people. And so it's like, even when things go through the full legal court process and the evidence doesn't support these claims, hands up, don't shoot, they still it's their propaganda, and it's not being challenged. And if you challenge it, you're called far right and a fascist sympathizer.
Going back a step, how has Portland changed over your lifetime? Is it a sort of shell of its former self when you were growing up there? Because I assume, Andy, and correct me if I'm wrong, but given your parents moved there, it must have been a tolerant and peaceful place to settle, right? And now it seems to have, far from being a sort of paragon of virtue and peace, it seems to have become a sort of beacon of intolerance, right?
Portland has, for decades now, been a political monoculture, a left-wing political monoculture, and I would say the citizenry in the city are probably more to the left of mainstream Democrats. And Portlanders have been quite proud of that. The unofficial slogan for the city is "Keep Portland Weird." So you'll see a lot of very, I guess you could describe them as progressive or different and alternative ways of living. In politics as well, socialism and communism appeals to a lot of people there. You actually see a lot of political activism around that, more than you would see with anything for like the Republican Party, for example. But and so as a result, there have been protests, lots of left-wing protests in the past, but they were, protests against the war. There was an Occupy Portland, but these were, compared to what we experienced last year, they were like not as severe and not so much shorter. It's just, there's been a buildup over the years, I think. And 2020 was kind of the building up of this full delegitimization of government and law enforcement and the American criminal justice system, to the point where there were people on city council who were expressing support for the Antifa and other extremists. We had one city council woman who faced no censure for putting into the public in a Marie Claire interview, saying that she said she had a conspiracy theory that Portland police were actually the ones starting fires and doing these arson attacks to blame left-wing protesters. She had absolutely no evidence for that. The police chief demanded that she provide evidence for making claims of felony criminal acts, and of course she didn't have any evidence. But this is what I mean, like, you're having elected politicians provide cover to the violent extremists. You have the media calling these violent extremists as just protesters
mostly
who are
peaceful,
exercising mostly peaceful. When they killed somebody in the summer, killed the Trump supporter, that didn't really get much coverage either. They kind of just glossed over the fact that he left the manifesto on his Instagram using the quote, "I am 100% Antifa." I'm talking about Michael Rhino. And he's somebody who had been arrested at another riot previously in Portland, and all his charges were dropped, and he didn't even go to jail. So,
where were they, Andy, when CNN had that now infamous shot of the banner saying "mostly peaceful" when the city, there was burning behind the reporter?
I believe that was in Minnesota when neighborhoods were torched to the ground. this is like how it's beyond through the looking glass. It's
Yeah,
a topsy-turvy media world. It's like how could you say that with a straight face as a
yeah,
reporter
totally,
when
totally.
things are being torched in the background? And it wasn't just property that was getting destroyed and looted. There were actually dozens of deaths related to the riots last year.
Mm.
People who were killed each other or in the course of rioting got killed. Lo So it's like, I
Yeah.
guess, their lives didn't mean anything if it was for this cause.
And Andy, I wonder then, you've sort of touched on this, but I wonder if you might reflect on what the sort of I think you do mention this in your New York Post piece actually, where Twitter's double standard in banning, they can ban the democratically elected President Trump from their platform for supposedly inciting violence, but you reveal that actually they've allowed Antifa to plan riots and acts of violence on their platform, and even you say today they've sort of posted about one as well. How come they're able to do that, yet the democratically elected President of the United States of America can be kicked off for supposedly inciting violence himself?
Yeah, this is the uneven application of the terms of service. What some of these Antifa accounts are doing actually very blatantly violate incitement to their policies against inciting violence or organizing criminal activity, but nothing gets done. Some of these accounts, these are not like accounts with like 10 followers. We're talking about the Youth Liberation Front, which was one of the groups responsible for organizing the months of riots in Portland last year. They're still operating. They have thousands of followers. You have the Road City Antifa, which is the largest and oldest Antifa organization in the US, the ones who were responsible in beating me in 2019. They're still online. So this is what I mean when like big tech is like allied essentially with these violent extremists on the left. And there's I'm very discouraged that um, no there's really no meaningful opposition to
Hmm.
stop this, from law enforcement to the private sphere to civil society. And my I hope that when people are reading this book that they just become more informed about the threat that we're dealing with, and at the same time to dispel some myths or misconceptions that are out there about Antifa.
Hmm. I wonder if you might talk a little bit about how Antifa do actually pose a threat to American democracy itself, because we heard throughout the last 4 years, I guess, that Trump was a sort of gateway for the far right, and that they're the biggest threat to democracy. That's been the sort of media and cultural elite narrative, I guess, that it's disinformation by the far right that's going to overthrow American democracy. And actually, you're saying, hang on a minute, we've got these organizations like Antifa who you guys just aren't scrutinizing whatsoever. You're giving them a pass each and every time. You're sort of allowing them to justify their violence and looting and all the rest of it because they've got some laudable sounding slogans like Black Lives Matter or anti-fascist. And actually, they're being allowed to overthrow not just the rule of law, but American democracy itself.
Yeah, so they're dangerous because by their own stated goals, for their worldview to come to fruition, America has to die. So that's why they work so hard in delegitimizing everything that makes up the nation state. So we're not just talking about um, the criminal justice system, law enforcement, or the rule of law. We're talking about the founding principles of the United States itself, the American philosophy, freedom of expression, um, free speech, um, freedom to worship,
Mm.
um, rights, property rights.
Hmm.
They're systematically attacking all of that, like, and not just from, they're not attacking it like from the legal aspect, they're attacking it from like undermining support for it in the public. And I think they're having quite success in large urban areas where there's quite a bit of tolerance for left-wing violent extremism, actually. And I think if we allow this movement to continue to go unchecked, I think what you will have is just a further breakdown of the rule of law and more instances of autonomous zones being set up. And the autonomous zones, actually, if you want to look at what Antifa state building looks like, go to one of these autonomous zones. It's, excuse my swearing, but they're shitholes. And they lead immediately to warlords fighting with one another, people coming in to build their own separate militias. I mean, the first thing that the people at Chaz did was create a hard border between themselves and the United States. They actually had checkpoints, and there were militia who were armed with weapons. Like, it sounds crazy. It sounds like a plot of a film, but this is what happened. In the mayor of Seattle, Jenny Durkin, last year infamously described the whole situation as it could be a summer of love. This is like, so...
It's Orwellian. It's sort of like doublespeak. It's sort of altering the meaning of words, right? And I mean, we see this in a lot of the radical left's activism at the moment. They seem absolutely hell-bent on one, rendering the term woman meaningless, for example, in the sort of self-identification debate. You've got President Biden saying in 2019 on trans rights that he would, in prisons actually, what a prisoner self-identifies as, he or she should be allowed to say they are and be sort of housed, I guess, in that sense. So if you say you're a woman, you go to a woman's prison. And that obviously has serious repercussions as far as women's right and access to sex-segregated spaces is concerned and being safe in those spaces. But the reason I mention that is that I think in so many ways it's sort of like, you know, oh, largely peaceful, summer of love and all these other things. It's changing the meaning of words. These people are sort of not even just hell-bent on burning things to the ground in quite a literal sense, actually bringing buildings to the ground, but also in changing the way in which we approach language even, and the tools that we use to communicate. It's that sort of thing that actually really scares me quite a lot. And the reason I'm, I guess, so passionate about what you're doing is because I fear for the United States of America, and the United States of America matters. Because without the US, you know, the whole sort of rules-based international system starts to fall down.
Yeah, so it's not... I'm glad you brought up the stuff about language and rhetoric and words, because they don't actually just change the meaning of words. They're like completely remaking it. And this is where... American Antifa has been cross-pollinated with a lot of critical race theory that comes from academe and left-wing intellectuals. So this is what I mean when I'm saying like how tenets of their ideology are mainstreamed, and that like people don't, when Antifa refers to violence, they refer to silence as violence. Wrong speak as violence, but literal violence is, when committed by them, is not violence. You hear them say looting, property destruction, it's not violence because it's not taking place, like, you know, against a natural person, on a person's physical body, I should say. They defined what peace is as well. They redefine what a protest is. Now, a protest is going around beating people or setting things on fire. So, and if we had a strong media, they would be pushing back on this blatant propaganda. But we've all been so myopically conditioned into focusing on the far right that many of us in the public don't realize things that are happening on the other side.
Absolutely. Why do you think you mentioned sort of, I guess, affluent, what I would describe as the middle class, but I don't mean that in the American sense. I mean, better off people in America, basically. Why has it sort of become a sort of high status opinion, do you think, to be a proponent, to be a champion, to be an advocate of these movements? Why has it become high status to say out and proud, I'm a communist? Which I dare say in your parents' generation, certainly in my parents' generation, admitting that you're a communist, you would be viewed as an absolute fucking lunatic, right? So why has it sort of all of a sudden become a high status opinion? What has actually happened to the West that has allowed these views to sort of become trendy and, dare I say, mainstream?
It's because the far left is able to intellectualize their extreme views, radical views, in a way that has become sort of conditioned through academia, through media, through film and writing, all that. In that it's introduced kind of incrementally, that you don't really realize how radical the ideas are until you completely leave that cult or reject it. I think the process of radicalization for Antifa, I write about this in the book, based on the documents that were leaked to me from Rose City Antifa, is that they actually put their recruits through a radicalization process that essentially is based on a university course in structure, in that you have readings that are assigned on a weekly basis, group discussions, they're held secretly, and various trainings to operationalize these ideas. And it introduces the ideas first by theory, and then, so it starts off kind of just entirely theoretical, like how is property rights linked to white supremacy and slavery, those type of ideas, implement these seeds that a radical thought, but eventually paved the ground to people thinking that it's an act of righteousness to loot businesses, to destroy businesses, to hurt people's livelihoods, because in their mind, they think it's fighting white supremacy and racism. It's the same thing with how they are implanted with ideas about being against the US. So the US is an imperialistic, fascist state, which harkens back a bit to this whole agenda from the communists dating back decades. If you go back to the interwar years of Germany, when there was the original Antifa, which was a paramilitary of the German Communist Party, which is really important. The people they considered fascists weren't just the Nazis, so it was actually anybody who opposed the Communist Party. So that included the Social Democrats, the center left, included liberals. When that ideology was the Antifa ideology was implemented at the state level in East Germany, they actually believed that they were fighting fascism by building the Berlin Wall. They called it the anti-fascist defense barrier against the West. So this whole remaking of words has been a work in progress for a long time, and I think they've accelerated in their success just in the past few years.
Yeah, that does terrify me. It's not hyperbole. I really mean that. What's it like for you? I mean, I get my fair share of hate online, right? I campaigned, I guess I don't mean to toot my own horn, but quite prominently for the UK to leave the European Union. Now that pissed quite a lot of people off, and a lot of people don't like me, sort of very Marmite character here in the UK. But I wouldn't say that my life is at risk. I wouldn't say that I've ever genuinely felt threatened, but beyond a few emails saying we're going to get you and stuff like that, and you just think, yeah, right, you're probably in your mother's basement, like, I don't know, masturbating all day or something. And I've never felt genuinely threatened. But the sort of threats that are made to you, the actual attack that took place in 2019 in which you were hospitalized, what does that do to you? Have you ever thought, right, I'm going to give this up. I'm in too deep now. These people are terrifying. They mean business. They're going to use every tool in the book as far as threats to my life are concerned. They actually will implement them. and the media and the politicians and all the rest of it are giving them a free pass to do this sort of thing. So have you ever thought, this is too much, I'm just going to pack it in? What spurs you on? What gets Andy Ngo out of bed on a morning to do this?
I remind myself that I'm very, very privileged to have the platform and reach that I do. There are lots of other independent journalists who do similar stuff to me, and they don't have the same type of reach that I do. They haven't had the opportunities to go on mainstream broadcast television to write for mainstream publications. So I'm given like this really rare gift of being able to reach a large audience, and I would be squandering it away if I let fear get in the way, that I just focus on something that was less risky. Yes, it is incredibly scary to have been living in a city where people who beat me so badly that I ended up with a brain bleed that I required a year of medical treatment to recover from various deficiencies caused by that brain injury, to have nobody be arrested, to give names of suspects to law enforcement for that to not result in any follow-up. All of that is terrifying. And then also to know that not only do they know where I live, but they have also looked at the information of my loved ones as well and have actually visited my home. So this is like the terrorism that they do. It's not just acts of actual assault. It's like this unending stream of, we're going to kill you. We know where you live. This is where you actually live. We'll actually show up to your house. And they show that they actually can kill. They've killed already somebody in Portland just months ago. They bring weapons to beat their opponents on the head and the face. And most of the time, they don't even get identified by police, much less arrested and charged. So I think, with that said, what gives me, I guess, inspiration to continue doing is, in addition to the audience size that I have, is I can't be silent on such a dangerous and threatening movement and ideology. Mm-hmm. Like, I could be, I could be fine writing about other things, but I have to remind myself it wasn't just me who faced assaults over and over. There's been so many other people, and they have had no justice as well. So I need to fight for those people as well, and that's why I do what I do.
Andy, to end then, I wonder if you might sort of summarize for us how you see things progressing over the next 4 years. You mentioned it there. We've got a new administration in the United States of America. The Democrats are large and in charge, and now this sort of extreme left's favourite bogeyman, Donald J. Trump, is out of office. You're not at all confident that this is all going to go away, that this is all going to stop. I mean, they would argue America's now been placed on a path of healing and reconciliation, in which all of this sort of thing will be history, and that your book is irrelevant and we don't need it. It's unnecessary. This is all going to be fine. Andy Ngo isn't necessary. It's all going to be great. Why are they wrong, Andy?
They're wrong because you can see that the left in America are acting like sore winners. They're really out for blood for anybody who expressed support for Donald Trump. They're really systematically working on ruining the lives of people who attended the rally on the 6th, who had nothing to do with the Capitol Hill riot, but was merely there to see the sitting president speak. They are out to silence their opponents using their allies in big tech. And Antifa have rioted after the election in November continuously. It's happened in Portland. There's no media attention focusing on that. There are riots planned for later today. And all the variables that have allowed Antifa to continue to be a threat are still there. even with this new administration coming in, and Antifa, by their own statement, do not recognize any American government. So they view the Democrats as much as enemies as they do the Republicans.
Yeah. Well, Andy, thank you so much for giving up your time. I'll put a link in the description to your book, which everyone should absolutely check out, because it really does open your eyes. And I think much of the audience will agree as well that you are incredibly brave, and you're doing really important work. So people should definitely check out your Twitter account whilst they can.
Thank you very much.
Now, I'm sure you'll be desperate as well to hit that subscribe button and the notification bell to make sure that you don't miss out on any future content. And I will see you next time. Reasoned relies upon grassroots donations from people like yourself that want us to continue producing our high quality, free thinking content. So please do consider clicking the link and donating, no matter how big, no matter how small, because it really does ensure that we can keep on keeping on.